Okay, we pick up this week where we ended last week. It seems that 90% of the time, we'll say 90% of the time, you take a stand for truth, for righteousness, you're going to be run down. You're going to be mocked. You're going to be laughed at. You're going to be looked at as if you're strange. And we see in our study here in Nehemiah exactly that fact. In Nehemiah 2:19 we look, remember the mockery that was thrown the way of the Jews. The Jews were belittled. Those that were attacking them used intimidation by saying, even accusing them of rebelling against the king, which they weren't, but they were being charged with that. And we saw Nehemiah's response to that. And Nehemiah 4, verses 1 to 3, again, we see mockery. We're introduced to Sanballat in that passage. And in Nehemiah 4, 7, and 8, now we see a little bit bigger gathering of enemies, and they were filled with jealousy and anger. And Nehemiah takes care of them in 4 and 9. And now Nehemiah 6, 1 to 4. We see here something new now, a new tactic to bring them down. Nehemiah 6, 1 to 4. We read there, "Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and that there were no breaks left in it, though at the time I had not hung the doors in the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, 'Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono.' But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, 'I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you?' But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner." Here, what do we see here that Nehemiah's enemies were using as a tactic? What would you call that? What were they doing to Nehemiah? How would you say that, Jeff?
Well, it looks like their intention is to take out the leader, simply to get him down there and do harm to him.
Right. And so, but they're sneaky about it, aren't they? You notice they tried to lure them, is kind of what I was heading to. They just couldn't run in and kill him. So they tried to lure him down there by saying, "Let's meet, let's talk." Kind of a friendly idea. But that's right. They wanted to kill the leader, and they were working on Nehemiah's curiosity, maybe. Little did they know that wouldn't work with him. But they tried that 4 times. And verse 3 is Nehemiah's response again. And I quite enjoyed his response here. He set them straight. "I'm doing a great work. I don't have time to come down." And the question, why should I? But those kinds of tactics can be used on us also. And so we need to always be aware of that. And Nehemiah, down to verses 5 to 8, here we see, 5 to 8. Maybe we take 2 verses each. We'll start with Jeremy and Naomi. Do you want to split that up?
Then sent Sanballat his servant unto me in like manner the 5th time with an open letter in his hand, wherein was written, "It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu said it, that you and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause you build the wall, that you may be their king according to their words.
And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah, and now the king will hear of these reports. So now come and let us take counsel together. Then I said to him, saying, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inviting them out of your own mind.
Okay, so what do we see here? They've stepped up, to me, they've stepped up their deception here. What are they offering to Sanballat here, or to Nehemiah here? They've been charged, right? Nehemiah's been charged with something here?
Rebellion.
Right, he's being charged with rebellion, and Sanballat, the way he's speaking here to Nehemiah, he says, so come therefore and let us consult together. He's hoping maybe that Nehemiah sees an offer of friendship and protection here, maybe. But Nehemiah doesn't see that. And we see in verse 8 and 9 his response to that. Jeremy?
I was going to say, he's using what we'd call hearsay. It's
Yeah.
reported that this is done. This wouldn't be allowed in a court of law. It's in a court of law. It says, "I saw you, and this is what." No. He's using hearsay. He's using rumor, and he's using false. Really, they're making it up. They're trying to get Nehemiah in trouble, and I'll let you finish with the rest. But it's sort of, it's not exactly what they did to Jesus when they set up liars to say what he said, but it's a very similar thing.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to tie all this, every one of these in with Jesus, but then I thought I'd be getting off on a tangent, so I didn't. But you're right. We see, all these tactics. Really, when you think of it, with all the stories of the prophets and down to Jesus, and then with ourselves, these tricks are used all the time, aren't they? But it's how we deal with them is the important thing. And Nehemiah is such a great example on how he handles all this. And just speaking now of what Jeremy was saying there, in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 6, we see Nehemiah's response to that. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they all were trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. The end of verse 9, again, we see that Nehemiah always ended with his response to God. And here he didn't ask to be remembered, he asked to strengthen my hands, that I can handle these remarks, this deception. And then in verses 10 to 14, this is an interesting move here. Nehemiah 10 to 14. Yeah, you don't have your glasses. Okay. Sandra, do you want to read? We'll read a verse each. We'll go Sandra and then over to Shudong and then up to Henry. So chapter 6, verses 10 to 14.
Afterward I came into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Zaliah, the son of Mehitabel, who was shut up, and he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night will they come to slay thee.
And I said, should such a man as I be, and who is there such as who will go into the temple to receive his life? I will not go in.
I replaced the right hand and not to see him, but that he had no Lord is against
For this reason he was high, that I shouldn't be afraid and act that way than sin, so that they might have cause for an evil report, that they might be fortunate. That God remembered the bear and set their nets according to this their work, and the prophets Nehemiah and the rest of the prophets who have made be afraid.
Oh, no, that's it. Yeah, 14. The end of 14. Okay, here, summing this up, everyone knew, first of all, Nehemiah was a devout man, right? So who do they use to attack him here? Who do you see here that they're using? Verse 14 kind of helps us.
Somebody on the inside.
Hey, right, Jeff. False prophets, even. That's pretty smooth, isn't it? They've gotten together some false prophets to try and trick Nehemiah. And what do they want Nehemiah to do? Just in your own words. In verse 10.
To hide out.
The which, huh?
To hide out in the temple. To go
Right.
where it's safe.
Right. Take them into the temple and close the doors. Which maybe sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? But there was a problem, wasn't there? Could Nehemiah go in there? No. He couldn't. He couldn't go within the temple wall, into the temple and shut the doors. And he knew that. And he even says that in verse 11. First of all, he said, should such a man as I flee? He asked that question first. Of course not. But then he even goes on and he says, and who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. It was verse 13 that he speaks of that as sin. For this reason, he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way and sin, so that they might have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. So Nehemiah saw the whole plan, didn't he? They're trying to make him afraid. They're trying to have him go into the temple, lock himself in there, which was a sin. And then he even knew what they were going to do afterwards. They're having me do this so they can charge me with this afterwards. And Nehemiah saw that. And his response to that, again in verse 14, he says, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works. And he goes on to mention now the false prophets and the prophetess Nodiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. Just some wonderful examples we've seen in all those points. Wonderful examples of trickery by those that would have you afraid to take a stand for truth, and then wonderful examples on Nehemiah's his character of how he handled all that. And so we'll leave that. I don't know if there's any comments on that. No. Well, next, wrong way. Remaining in our content of Nehemiah, the last is trusting God. And our last question was, how does Nehemiah's approach to the task of rebuilding the walls demonstrate his trust in God? We've looked at a lot of this, but Nehemiah 2, verses 18 and 20. 18 to 20. Jeff and Mom, do you want to read 2, Jeff? And Mom, you read verse 20? We'll just refresh our memories with.
And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king?
Then answered I them and said unto them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but we have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem.
Okay, and chapter 4, verses 14 and 20. Verse 14 says, and I looked, this is Nehemiah, and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And verse 20, wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. What do those verses tell us about Nehemiah? What do they tell us about Nehemiah and his trust in God, as far as his trust in God goes?
Not going to be deterred. He knows that this is the will of God and that they need to accomplish it and that nothing was going to stand in their way. If God was going to be for this, it was going to happen. And yeah, there might be adversity along the way. Yeah, there might be trouble along the way. But they needed to complete the work because it's what God wanted. And he knew that God would allow it to happen because that's what he wanted.
Exactly, Jeremy, exactly. His whole trust, wasn't it? It didn't matter what. It seems what he was up against. Even to the point of being challenged by the prophets, by other religious people, other people that were supposed to be taking a stand for God. Sometimes that can throw you. But Nehemiah, no. Right back in chapter 1, when Nehemiah heard of the distressed state of Jerusalem and her inhabitants, he's devastated, and he wants to help. Sometimes when there's problems arise elsewhere, maybe, it's not our problem. We'll pray for them, but our attitude might not be as strong as Nehemiah's. He was devastated. And his first reaction is found in verse 11 of chapter 1. He says, O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant. He's pleading already with God. I'm concerned. I want you to hear this. And to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. This is before Nehemiah went to see the king. He pleads with God, and he receives answer to that prayer, and he does something amazing again in chapter 2 and verse 4. Remember, after he spoke to the king, then the king says to him, what do you request? And then again immediately, what do we see Nehemiah do? Can you remember? What's the first thing he does there? Does he tell the king right away what he requests? What are we told in 2 and verse 4? What's he do first?
Pray.
Yeah, right, Jeremy. He prays. He prays to the God of heaven immediately. And then it says in verse 5, he speaks to the king. I found that interesting, that when the king asked him, we might be ready to rush in with our plea, but Nehemiah showed us that his first concern was quick prayer to God, seek the help. Then he went to the king. And once he has his permission, we see in his materials to start the job in verse 8, and we see there in verse 8 he gives the credit to, and we read in verse 8, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams, this is what he's asking the king, for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me, then what does he say? According to the good hand of my God upon me. That kind of jumped out at me. It wasn't according to my good efforts of trying to help my brethren. Wasn't according to my righteousness and desire to help. No, Nehemiah gives the credit where it belongs, according to the good hand of my God. In every case of opposition that we just looked at, Nehemiah resorted to what? For moral strength, vindication, and help. Jeremy just told us, to God. And when all is completed and Jerusalem is safe, he gives credit again to whom? In chapter 6 and verse 16, he says, and it happened when all our enemies heard of it, now that the wall's been built, okay, the news has gotten out, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. So what I saw in that, or what do you see in that verse? Is there something that jumped out at you? Maybe thinking along the lines, what I was thinking along the lines of was that Nehemiah always went to God with his requests. He always gave God the praise, put his trust in God. And what do we see the results of all that in verse 16? What was the result of that? Do you see one in there, or maybe you have a different thought? What did his enemies see? Jeff?
The influence that his actions and the people's action had on those people, because they've done something they haven't been able to do for how many decades?
Right.
And then someone shows up and someone that shows complete trust in God, and all of a sudden something is accomplished.
Right.
What other reason could they attribute?
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking at the time of reading this verse. Our desire should be that others will come to an understanding like us of God, and that others will repent and humble themselves in God's eyes. And so when we do right, when we're charged wrongly, and yet we strive to do right and take a stand for righteousness, there's some that are going to give that, they're going to see where that credit is owed to, is due to. And here we see that those that tried to work against Nehemiah all along, now they're disheartened. They're a little bit ashamed, aren't they? And then they perceive in themselves that this was done by God. And exactly what Nehemiah would have wanted for them to see. So we just see that Nehemiah is another outstanding, faithful Bible character. And always we saw through all those scenes, he asked God that God would remember him. Remember me. Remember what I've done. And not in a bragging sense. Nehemiah was always asking, remember me, when he needed the strength, when he needed help. And he left those thoughts with God. And I think we thank Nehemiah, don't we, for his example. It gives us something to strive for. And so we end Nehemiah with our outline. It looks like we're not going to get into Ezra or Esther, but that's all right. But Nehemiah, then we see his first duty, his first job was the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. That's why he went back there. In chapters 8 to 13, we see the renewal of the covenant. Remember, all his effort to have had been forgotten. You know, the covenant with God and all those that had been in captivity, all was forgotten. You know, the priests didn't even remember their duties. And then we see in chapters 13, 4 to 31, the reforms that Nehemiah did for Israel. And so we'll end. I don't know if there's any ending comments. No, Jeff?
One thing that stands out now, I mean, right from the very beginning, Nehemiah's great love for God and for his people, his brethren, Israelites. I mean, right from the beginning, he weeps for the condition of his people and the condition of Jerusalem, and he's determined to do something that God wants him to do, and God will see him through that. You know, he works with his people, his brethren, he encourages them, he helps them, but yet you brought out that point with that person on the inside, that person who was a secret informer in chapter 6 and verse 10, who gave him bad advice and told him to hide in the temple in case he... It's difficult with your brethren. It's one thing to stand against the ungodly and know they are clearly the enemy, but here's one of the people that he's working with and helping and encouraging and building up, and this person has given him bad advice and wants him to, you know, do this. You know, this is for the best, so you don't die. We need you, the leader. He does not listen to the advice of his brother. Instead,
Right.
he recognizes this person has given me bad advice. Somebody's false here.
Right. Good
It's
point.
the biggest challenge of all.
Yeah, good point to end on. That's true. Adversity can even come from other brethren. Okay, well, we'll end with that then, and next week we'll begin in Esther.